Well, thank you to the choir. That was lovely. It's good to be with you today. Today we're finishing up the final sermon for our sermon series this summer on the letters of Paul. Summer is wrapping up. Last night I started to think about, do I have enough firewood for the winter? Anybody else ready for that first fire, right? Okay, maybe not. Okay, so let's just jump into it then. Paul's letter to Philemon. It's very short. You can read it quickly, 23 verses long. This short letter, though, is packed with innuendos, with implicit messages, with inklings of social justice, with possible reconciliation. Let me read from you just a few of the opening verses from the first chapter there. Paul says this: "When I remember you in my prayers, I always thank my God, because I hear of your love for all of the saints and your faith towards the Lord Jesus. I pray that the sharing of your faith may become effective when you perceive all the good that we may do for Christ. I have indeed received much joy and encouragement from your love, because the hearts of the saints have been refreshed through you, my brother." So basically, in this short letter, there are three main characters that you need to know about and that we're going to focus on today and think about how it applies to our lives today. The first, of course, is Paul. Paul was writing this letter when he was being held in prison in Rome. He was under house arrest. Here's how house arrest worked in the ancient world. When you were placed under house arrest, you were usually on the third or fourth floor of a building. A Roman guard or a centurion soldier would be literally shackled to you for 24 hours a day. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? While the prisoner is shackled to the guard, the prisoner is responsible not only for all of his own needs or her own needs, but also for all of the needs of the Roman soldier. So Paul needed someone to be helping him out. And here's where character number 2 in this story comes in. Character number 2 is hang on. I got it spelled out phonetically here. It's a little, okay. Onesimus. Say it with me. Onesimus. All right. Onesimus is character number 2. Onesimus in this story is a runaway slave. Now, we don't know all the details, but we know that he ran away from the city of Colossae, which was 1,500 miles away, to the city of Rome, because the city of Rome was this capital cosmopolitan city where you could kind of live a life on the lam and nobody would really be looking for you. Onesimus had stolen money and valuables and belongings from his owner. And how he was introduced to Paul, we don't know. But we know that to Paul, he became an invaluable friend, servant, companion. And Paul actually refers to him as his son, as his brother in Christ. That's character number 2. Character number 3 is Philemon. Now, Philemon is the person who lives in the city of Colossae, who's receiving this letter from Paul, who was the master of the slave Onesimus. Philemon also had a conversion moment when he heard Paul preach one time. And because of this, he created a church, literally a house church that had its own pastor, that met at his place of residence. So when Paul sends this letter, he addresses it to Philemon, to the church members, to Philemon's wife, and it makes it clear that Philemon is deeply rooted in the cause of the church, and that Onesimus is indeed a slave that has run away from him. Now, before we go any farther, just to say, very pointedly and clearly, any form of slavery or injustice is inexcusable. There is no doubt about that. And in this letter, Paul Paul starts to talk to Philemon. Paul says to Philemon, hey, I have encountered this person named Onesimus, and he says that he knows you. And I told him that I did as well, and we started to develop this conversation. And here's what I'm asking you to do. I want to ask you to consider a very big favor, a favor that is uncalled for, unheard of. But I want you to do this, and I want you to do it because I have learned to appreciate Onesimus so greatly, and even though he helps me out 24 hours a day, I want to send him back to you, and I'm asking you to do me a favor, and whatever this favor costs, put it on my bill. That's the favor that Paul is asking. Now, the way that the letter system worked is that you would have to have the military take your letters during the ancient world or pay for a courier or something like that. Well, Paul asks Onesimus to deliver the letter back to Philemon. Now, stick with me here. If Onesimus delivers the letter to Philemon, he is taking the letter from Paul to the owner he ran away from, where the penalty of running away as a slave is death. So Paul is asking Onesimus to trust in everything that he has taught him, to carry this letter to Philemon, and to trust that Philemon will do what Paul asked. Paul's very clear that he doesn't command him to do this. He asked him to do this. And he says, put it on my bill, whatever it may be. Now, if you were Onesimus, would you have been willing to take that letter back to Philemon? I don't know. Probably not, right? I came across a story this week. It's an old story, and I'm going to read you a part of it, and it's going to take a few minutes, but it's really good. But it's a short story, and the title of it is Rag Man. So let me just read it to you, and it kind of dovetails into what Paul is talking about here. Listen to how the narrator describes this. On dawn one early Friday morning, I noticed a young man, handsome and strong, walking the alleys of our city. He was pulling an old cart filled with clothes, both bright and new, and he was calling in a clear voice, "Rags! Rags, new rags for old. I take your tired rags, rags." Now this is a wonder, I thought to myself, for the man stood 6'4", and his arms were like tree limbs. His eyes flashed intelligence. Why did he have this job in the city? Well, I followed him, and soon the rag man saw a woman sitting on her porch. She was sobbing into a handkerchief. She was sighing and shedding 1,000 tears. Her knees and her elbows made a sad X. Her shoulders shook. And the rag man stopped his cart, and he walked up to the woman, and he said, "Give me your rag, and I'll give you another." Well, he slipped the handkerchief from her eyes, and she looked up, and he laid across her palm a linen cloth so new and clean that it shined, and she blinked from the gift to the giver. And then as he started to pull his cart again, the rag man did a strange thing. He put her stained handkerchief to his own face, and then he began to weep. And he began to sob like she had cried, and his shoulders were shaking, and she did not shed another tear. Well, he keeps walking as the story goes on, and he says, "Rags, rags, new rags for old." And he sees a man who's leaning against a telephone pole, and the rag man asks him, "Do you have a job?" "Are you crazy?" says the man, and he pulls away from the pole, and you can see the sleeve of his jacket, and that it hangs there empty because he had no arm. And the ragman said, "Give me your jacket, and I'll give you mine." So the man takes off his jacket, and the ragman does too, and they trembled with one another, and they exchanged their jackets. And now the man against the telephone pole had 2 good arms, and the ragman only had 1. Well, the story continues, and then the ragman finds a man lying drunk and unconscious, sick and hunched over, tired. And the ragman takes a blanket from his cart and he lays it on the man. And then he picks up that old, yucky, nasty blanket. And the man wakes up from sleep fresh and anew. Well, the narrator follows this ragman all throughout the story, and everywhere they stop, they exchange the old rags for the new rags for the old rags. And whatever is weighing this person down, whatever is keeping them from being free, whatever is preventing them from knowing what it means to live fully, the ragman takes it on. So eventually the ragman makes his way to this landfill, and he sits down, and he's crying, and he's covered in that old blanket, and he dies. Well, the narrator watches all of this, and then he wakes up, only he realizes that he slept for 2 days straight, and that all of a sudden it's a Sunday morning, and the sunlight is coming in, and there is the rag man again. And the blanket is folded carefully, and there's a scar on his forehead, but he has both of his arms, and there's no sign of the sorrow or the age. And the narrator looks, and then he takes off the clothes on his body, and he says to the ragman, and he says, "Dress me." And the narrator says, "He dressed me, he put new rags on me. My Lord did this." And the ragman said, "I am the Christ." Now think about this for a moment. Paul asked Onesimus, a runaway slave, to go back to Philemon and to ask him to forgive him and to free him. And Paul says to Philemon, whatever the cost is for this, put it on my tab. In other words, Paul says, I'm willing to risk my life for you. Now, why would Paul do that? Why was Paul so willing to give his life for somebody else? Here's what I think. I think that Paul knew and shared with Onesimus that no matter what our circumstance in life may be, we are already free and belong to no one but God. Now, the problem with Philemon is that it's only 23 verses long, and we don't have the letter back in response, and we don't know how the story ends. That's a little troubling. But what we do have is a kind of like a journal entry from the bishop of Antioch in Syria from 107, the year 107. Well, the bishop's name was Ignatius, and Ignatius was being taken to Rome, where he was going to be held in prison. But on the way, remember it's a long trip, 1,500 miles, he's stopped, and they spend the night, and he's in a little jail cell. And the bishop of the church of Ephesus comes to visit him and to pray with him. And when Ignatius writes this letter, this entry, the bishop, the one that's leading the entire church in the Roman Empire, can you guess what his name was? Onesimus. Onesimus. There are times in your life when you need to let someone go, whatever that means, whatever form that takes. There are times in your life when you have to let go, when you have to forgive. And there are also times in your life when you have to ask to be forgiven, when you need a new start, a new beginning. And why can we do this? How can we do this? It's because we know the teachings of God and of Jesus, the teachings that were so profound when Paul experienced them that he was willing to die in prison. The teachings that were so impactful that Paul was willing to risk not only his life, but the life of the one whom he called his son. There is power in forgiveness, and there is power in living freely. So if you need to walk that road, and we all do at one time or another, may you do so with courage and with the knowledge that Jesus walks the road with you. Through Christ we say together, Amen.